All right, as you can see, we are today going to look at Amos and the problem of slavery. I have, as you may have noticed, tried to focus on texts that I think people find difficult or ideas that people find difficult, and I try to work through them and try to figure out what's going on and try to the best of my ability, interpret the text and deal with the problem issues. So the problem issue I want to take on today is the issue of slavery in the Old Testament. So what is the problem? First, it is clear the Bible permits slavery. It exists. There are laws regarding slavery, but clearly slavery as an institution, certainly in the Old Testament, is not prohibited. In the past, advocates of slavery appealed to the Bible to justify the practice. Now, this was especially the case in the United States before the Civil War, before the American Civil War, because, of course, slavery was the major issue that prompted the war. And the American South had slaves, and also it was a bastion of Christianity. And I will tell you that this is a matter of, how can I put it? It humbles those of us who are part of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, because in fact, several of our founders were slave owners, and their prosperity was in part built upon slavery. And so that is something that we have had to confront and have had to deal with. But apart from that issue, the broader issue is the fact that people believe they can appeal to the Bible to justify slavery, or on the other hand, they say because the Bible allows for slavery, the Bible has no moral authority. And so this will be the case today among many who reject biblical teaching, especially on sexuality and such matters, claiming that the Bible is a biased book. It is twisted in favor of a patriarchy and in favor of the powerful and the elite, and that the laws regarding sexuality and the laws regarding slavery are both examples of how the Bible is skewed in favor of this elite. And they also, again, as I had said, this indicates that the Bible has no moral authority, and thus it is wrong to appeal to the Bible for guidance, for direction in regards to moral matters. So, of course, you can see how this plays out in the whole debate over human sexuality in the current environment. Thus, as I say, some argue this demonstrates the Bible is morally backward, trapped in a cultural context, and is on the side of an oppressive elite. So that is what we want to deal with today. First, the word leved, which means slave. So you'll hear me use this word a few times. It'll be on the screen. As you can see what the Hebrew looks like. So we need to get used to this word. This is the word that is translated, among other things, as slave. So repeat after me. Leved. You can say it. It's a le, and a ved. So repeat after me. Leved. Leved. That is a slave. All right. It often does just mean slave. So here are a number of example texts. We're not going to look at them, but you can find many, many texts where the word plain and simply means slave, and that's that. But it often refers to any subordinate. That is, a person can be a free person or even a person with high authority and still be referred to as an eved. A high official, such as a magistrate, a military officer, or a priest, was eved, servant, to some higher official, ultimately to the king. And again, we have a lot of example passages. We won't look at them. But the high officials of Pharaoh, his aristocrats, the noblemen who ran the government just underneath him were all called his servants, his evadim, servants. Same word. So we do need to understand and recognize the word is used with a much broader range of meaning than simply slave, as we understand the term. People of relatively lower status routinely referred to themselves as the servants, evadim, of higher-ranking persons as a matter of politeness or deference. So this is just your relative status in society. And many societies are very hierarchical in their way of speaking. And when two people meet each other, they kind of jockey around in their conversation trying to figure out who is on a higher rank. Maybe the person has a higher office or the person is older. And once they get that figured out, the one person will speak in a more ordinary form of vocabulary. That's the higher ranking person. The other person will speak in more deferential vocabulary. That's the lower ranking person. They both might be pretty important people. Like one could be the president of a company and the other a vice president, but the vice president will speak in more honorific terms to the president. So Hebrew doesn't have exactly this kind of system. You'll find this system, for example, in Korean. But in Hebrew, people of relatively lower rank will refer to the other person as master and refer to themselves as servant. In their world, everyone was someone else's eved. With very few exceptions, unless you were the king of kings like the emperor of Persia or something, in their world, everybody ranked somewhere in the hierarchy of society, and so you are in the status of eved or servant to someone else. The household slave had the same relationship to his master as a general had to a king. Now, they were clearly different. Clearly, a general had certain rights and privileges and powers that a household slave did not have. But in terms of their relationship to the person who has authority over them, in both cases, the servant would refer to himself as, when speaking to his boss, he would speak of himself as your servant. He would not say I, he would say your servant, and that would be his term for I. And he might refer to his boss as my Lord. So it doesn't matter where you are in society, everybody is someone else's eved. The Old Testament routinely refers to Israelite leaders such as Abraham, Moses, David, the prophets, and so forth, as Yahweh's servants, using exactly the same term. Genesis 26:24, etc. So again, a lot of examples of that. Thus, the word did not have the brutally negative connotations for the Israelites that the word slave has for us. The word slave for us has one meaning and one meaning only. It is someone who, against his or her will, is in bondage to another party and must work for that other party for free and can be subject to all kinds of abuse and use and abuse because the slave is purely and simply the property of the other party. It is a legalized form of bondage and forced free labor. So that is strictly what the word slave is in the English language. All I'm getting across to you at this point is the biblical term eved has a much broader range of meaning. And so just at that point, that doesn't fully solve the problem for us, but it helps us to understand the biblical world better, understand their culture better. If we hear that, even a great Israelite like David or Hezekiah or somebody had slaves, well, that's true. But you do need to understand how the term is used and is part of Israelite culture as opposed to how it is in the modern West. Was Israel a hierarchical society? Yes, but there is a qualification we need to add. Pre-monarchic Israel, since it had no king, was more egalitarian than monarchical Israel. Now, this is something that people often don't reflect upon. It is quite an astonishing thing when you think about it. The period of the judges. It's a major topic. We won't go into detail, but just very briefly. The amazing thing about the period of judges is they had no national government whatsoever. None. They had no capital city. They had no legislative assembly. They had no president. They had no king. They had zero national government. In that sense, pre-monarchic Israel was a genuine anarchy, not in the sense of being always chaotic. And they did have local governance in tribes and towns and villages and so forth, ways of governing a local institution like a town through village elders and so forth. But in terms of a national government, they did not have one. And obviously this raises all kinds of issues, but just to make a long story short, Israel's king was supposed to be Yahweh. They were supposed to recognize him and acknowledge God as their king, and they were supposed to live under Torah, the law, as the rules of the king. But they were apostate, and as such, they truly were anarchic in the worst sense of the word, that is to say, fell into chaos in the famous little refrain of the book of Judges, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. But the point here is the early ideal of Israel is not a totally flat society. They still had this hierarchical concept of elders having higher authority and having respect for certain people in certain positions. But it was not this really structured hierarchy such as you have in a kingdom, because they had no king. They had no kingdom. And in a sense, that was the ideal originally given to Israel, that they would be a much more equal society, because God was supposed to be their king, not any individual person. And with God as their king, and if they truly submitted to God and submitted to the law and followed it, they would not only be faithful to God and be a wholesome people and keep the covenant, they would also be able to maintain a very high level of freedom. But they blew that because they were apostate. But you do remember, for example, that in the book of Judges, kingship was simply not part of the process. So, Samuel warned the Israelites against choosing a king, saying that they would all become slaves of the king. 1 Samuel 8:17 says specifically, when you choose a king for yourself, he will take your sons and your daughters to be your servant. He'll take your lands. He will take your livestock. He will rule every aspect of your life. He will show favorites, give favors to some of his favorites, and you will be his slaves. And in that sense, he is using the word in the most pejorative sense of the term. You will have no rights before the king. You will be people who will be totally subject to the whims of the king. And so it is quite remarkable. The people wanted a king. They demanded a king. As you recall, Samuel went to God and asked God what he should do. He was very grieved. God said to Samuel, go ahead and do what they have asked. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me from being king over them. We have an echo of this even back again in the book of Judges, where you remember the people offered the kingship to Gideon. And Gideon, for all his faults, and he did have his faults, but for all his faults, Gideon reflected the old ideal when he said, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. Yahweh will rule over you. But again, the Israelites, through apostasy, blew it, and having fallen into true anarchy and chaos, they demanded a king. Now, it's important to see here that Israelites considered hierarchy to be normal. It was part of their language when they used the term Eved, but they did not believe extreme stratification of society was ideal. That is to say, when Samuel warns them, you will become the king's slaves, that strikes a chord. That is to say, it is part of the ancient Israelite ideology that people should not be under such a rigid hierarchy that you've got one people who just rules everybody and everyone else is his slave. So yes, the Israelites did, in their language, in their culture, in their way of dealing with each other, they did have a notion of certain people are of higher rank, certain people are of lower rank. You need to show respect and deference to people of higher rank, people who are older, and so forth. But they did not believe in this absolute stratification hierarchy whereby some people really mattered and some people were just nothing. Some people were just to be regarded as slaves. That was not their ideal. And if you want to go all the way back to Genesis 1, their ideal is that every person, male and female, is created in God's image. So that is the kind of linguistic and historical context to the term. None of the things I've said so far fully answers the question of how do we deal with slavery in the Bible. But hopefully it gives you a better sense of what the word meant, what it connoted to the ancient Israelites, and also to get a sense that yes, they did believe in a hierarchical society within limits, but they did not believe that some people were inherently better than others or that some people should have absolute authority over everybody else. Slavery existed among the Israelites primarily as a means for dealing with debt. So here we're dealing with the social context, and we want to really address the issue of slavery as such. It is important to understand, how did one Israelite go into slavery to another? Well, he went into slavery because he got into debt, because he became very poor for whatever reasons. He became very impoverished and he couldn't pay his debts, or he was afraid he would starve, his family would starve, and he could sell himself or his whole family into slavery to another Israelite. Slavery, therefore, if you want to put it really bluntly, was Israel's way of dealing with the problem of poverty. Every society has the problem of poverty, and we try various means to deal with it. We try various strategies as cultures and under governments to figure out a way that we can address the ongoing problem that some people are very poor. And if they don't get some kind of relief, they will starve. And so you have to do something to avert this. Their way was to allow a person to sell himself into slavery to a more well-off family, and that person then would work for them, would be their slave. I mean, it was true slavery. He was their property. He would work for them, but he in turn would have a roof over his head and would have food to eat and would be able to survive. Our solution is quite different. Our solution essentially is built upon a welfare model. So my point here is both societies have different ways of dealing with the problem. This is how ancient Israel dealt with it. An Israelite who fell into crushing poverty, thus, as I just said, could be sold into slavery or offer himself as a slave. This provided a means for settling debts with creditors and enabling a person to survive. So it's pretty straightforward. You can't pay your bills. You're in danger of starving. You go into slavery. The person who buys you as part of the purchase, he pays off your debts, and you are now that person's slave. The slave, therefore, would not starve out in the streets. He would not be homeless. He would not be destitute and starving. He would have a roof over his head. He would have food to eat, but he would have to work as the slave of his master. Like all other attempts to address the problem of poverty, it was imperfect. You can obviously figure out how there could be abuses of this system, that someone could kind of rig the game to get someone to fall into poverty and then buy that person as a slave, so that you have kind of coerced the situation and created for yourself a slave. And of course, in the prophets, you have a great deal, as well as in Psalms, a great deal of warning and condemnation of those who exploit others, who exploit the poor. And obviously, this was one way you could possibly exploit the poor, especially if you managed the courts that would adjudicate things like debt and things like that. So clearly, it was imperfect and it was subject to abuse. I would say, however, that every system is imperfect and is subject to abuse. Welfare systems are subject to abuse. They also have the moral hazard, as economists would call it. They have the moral hazard of incentivizing a culture of dependence, so that you have multiple generations that go from generation to generation living off welfare. It is not a perfect system. It is a system that has flaws and problems. The Israelite system of slavery was imperfect, but it was a way to deal with it. It is important to recognize, however, that the Israelite slave was a debt slave, not a person kidnapped into slavery. So what was legitimate was, I had a really terrible crop this year. I had no harvest. I can't pay my loans. I'm in trouble of losing all my land and starving to death, and my family's starving. And so you sell yourself into slavery to pay off the debts and to work it off and so forth. That was Israelite slavery. Israelite slavery was not going out and kidnapping another person and making that person into a slave. And that is a very, very important distinction. Now, we have to say slavery was still slavery. It's not that the ancient Israelite slave necessarily had a wonderful life. Their masters would have been like people everywhere. Some would have been kind and good. Some would have been cruel and exploitative. That's how life is. And slavery was slavery. So, for example, the laws regarding slavery, Exodus 21, verses 20 and 21, when a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies by his hand, the slave certainly must be avenged. But if the slave can stand after a day or two, he will not be avenged, for the slave is the owner's property. Now, that's pretty straightforward. The slave is still a slave. He has not lost his humanity. If he is beaten by an owner and dies, then that owner has committed murder. And so he has not ceased to be a human being. And although the punishment is not specified, it certainly would be severe. It is an act of murder. However, the slave was the property of the owner, and the owner could beat the slave. So I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. Slavery in ancient Israel was slavery, no doubt about it. Thus, an Israelite slave was the property of others and of another, and thus had fewer rights. Now, he did not have no rights. As I just said, he was regarded as a human being, and killing him even by his owner was an act of murder. But he clearly had fewer rights. If the owner went out just to another person and attacked him, the owner would be punished under the law, either by himself being beaten or by paying a fine. But he could beat his servant and suffer no punishment whatsoever. By definition, as the property of another, slavery was degrading. And it's important to understand the Bible does not hide this. The Bible does not sugarcoat it. Again, people will say simply, the Bible allows slavery, therefore the Bible is an immoral book. But the Bible, even as it allows slavery under the conditions I've described, it understands that slavery is a degrading situation. And it deals with it in those terms. For example, an Israelite slave is referred to as a Hebrew, a term for Israelites in Egyptian bondage in Exodus 1-10. See Exodus 21:2, Deuteronomy 15:12, etc. Here's the point. What is the normal term for an Israelite? Normal term for an Israelite that they would use with each other, their self-identification is that they were the Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Israel, the children of Israel, that, in other words, Israelite. That is their term for themselves. That's their self-identification. Where you see the term Hebrew used, that is to say, a Hebrew person, it is primarily used when the Israelites were in slavery in Egypt. And there they are repeatedly referred to as Hebrews. And then when you come back to the legislation where it talks about an Israelite in bondage, even in slavery to another Israelite, the slave is called a Hebrew. Why is he called a Hebrew? It's to acknowledge the fact that he has gone into a degraded situation. He's no longer in possession of the full status Yahweh granted his people in the Exodus. In Egypt, they were slaves. They were Hebrew slaves. Yahweh took them out of Egypt in the Exodus and gave them freedom, and they were no longer the Hebrews, they were the Israelites. So by going back into slavery, he is kind of losing or giving up part of his Israelite heritage. He is taking on a degraded situation. And why would the Bible use that terminology? To make the point. This is not a good situation. This is not something you want to do. If you can avoid it, avoid it. As I just said, therefore, an Israelite who's fallen into slavery has reverted to what he was prior to the Exodus. This implies that the slave should get out of slavery as soon as it was feasible. Generally speaking, as a general rule, slavery was not thought of as a good situation. It was a reversion to being a Hebrew. Now, you all know the rule. If a person was really happy in his situation, he had a very kind master, he was well provided for, he was in a secure situation, he could say, you know what, I just want to stay the servant of my master. And he would go through a ritual in which he would have his ear pierced, and he would be marked forever as that person's slave. But the general understanding was this is not a status you want to stay in. It does carry degrading connotations, and you should get out of it. The New Testament has the same outlook. 1 Corinthians 7:21, Paul, when he's speaking to people in various statuses of life, and he tells them, be content in the status you're in. When he comes to talking about slavery, Paul will talk about how as a slave you should, when you're serving your master, you should do it as unto the Lord. You should not do it out of fear of man or simply to work, to look like you're working hard when you're really not, all that kind of thing. But he does make the point. If you can get out of slavery, do it. It is a degrading situation. And of course, we're all familiar with the situation of Philemon when this slave escaped and came to Paul and apparently then was converted, and Paul wrote back to his master. The slave Onesiphorus fled Philemon, and Paul wrote back to Philemon. He encouraged him to manumit the slave, to release the slave from all obligations and release him to serve and help Paul. So again, the idea is the ideal is not to be a slave. My point here is the Bible does not hold to this kind of rigid, hierarchical, patriarchal mentality that people will attribute it to. You know, the idea that says, well, some people are just by nature slaves and they should be slaves and they should be happy in that position because that's where they belong. The Bible doesn't take that position. The Bible acknowledges slavery is a harsh institution. It makes you the property of another person. It takes away a lot of your rights, even under the best of situations. And if you can get out of it, do so. If you're an Israelite, you want to be an Israelite, not a Hebrew. And of course, you know that slave owners were bound to release their slaves in the 7th year. Exodus 21:2, Deuteronomy 15:12. So this is, of course, an extremely important piece of Israelite legislation in Torah, that you could only hold a person for 7 years and then you had to release him. He had to be manumitted. Now, Israel was not the only society that had manumission of slavery. In ancient Rome, for example, it was not at all uncommon for owners to release their slaves. That is called manumission. But in Israel, it was obligatory. And it was a relatively short time that you could keep a person as a slave. With such an obligation in place, Israel could not build an economy on slavery. Now, certain ancient societies, as they became empires and as they took in large numbers of slaves and as the society became more and more polarized and hierarchical with a high elite and an impoverished lower class, you had massive numbers of slaves and the entire economy became a slave economy. And so this was the case in the later Roman Empire, when very rich people began to acquire huge numbers of slaves, and they had huge estates called latifundia, and they would simply have armies of slaves working their land. It was an economy totally based on slavery. And even manufacturing and work in the cities was mostly done by slaves. So that was how the Roman economy worked before it completely collapsed and fell. But it even continued somewhat in Europe under serfdom. In Israel, however, they could not have an economy based on slavery because you only could keep a slave for 7 years. And so you couldn't get enough slaves to have a slave-based economy. So their economy was based on the labor, basically, of free people. Some of them had slaves, many of them did not, but it was not a slave-based economy. So now we come to Amos 1:6. I had Amos at the beginning of the lecture. You wonder, where does Amos come in? Well, here he is. Thus says Yahweh, because of 3 transgressions of Gaza and because of 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they carried out a full-scale exile to hand them over to Edom. What was going on there? What was going on was kidnapping people for slavery. You attack a village, you kill a number of people, but you take all the rest, the healthier people, the younger people, the people you think will be valuable in the slave market. You carry them off to some place where there's a slave market like Edom, and there you sell them. They are kidnapped and they are sold into slavery. That is what Amos is condemning. Amos, at the beginning of his book, condemns a number of Gentile societies for various atrocious sins and warns that God is going to judge them for their sins before he finally gets to Judah and Israel and condemns them too. But the point at which we have this condemnation in the book of Amos is specifically kidnapping persons for enslavement, to sell them into slavery. In the ancient world, villages were sacked and people were kidnapped to be sold as slaves. This was quite common. Now, of course, you know it was not only in the ancient world. It also happened up into relatively recent European history, talking about several centuries ago, when, of course, you had the slave trade, whereby primarily Arab slavers would go into Africa, would attack villages, would take a bunch of people, would sell them into slavers who would put them on ships, such as the English slavers, and would carry them across the ocean, where they would be sold as slaves in places like the Southern American colonies. So that is what Amos is talking about. That's what happened in the ancient world, and that's what happened in the slavery that gave rise to the American system of slavery. American slavery, as I just said, was based on a similar practice. Amos 1:6 condemns Gaza to destruction for this crime. It is a heinous offense against God, and God will judge this Gentile people for this offense. Now, this is important because the judgment of God, surprisingly, is primarily focused on Israel and Judah. Amos says, "You alone have I known of all the nations, therefore I will judge you." So Israel is God's people. When Israel breaks the covenant and disobeys Torah, they come under judgment. They are his own. The Gentiles, obviously as God, maker of heaven and earth, God is ruler of all people, but the Gentiles are at a remove from Israel. They are not judged for breaking the covenant because they're not in covenant with Yahweh. They're not judged, for example, we talked about kosher. Gentiles can break kosher all they want. They won't be judged for it. But there are heinous sins, atrocities they can commit for which they will be judged, even though they're not the covenant people. And here in this case, Gaza is going to suffer destruction because they engaged in slave trade. Individual kidnappers were to be put to death. Deuteronomy 24:7, if someone is caught kidnapping a fellow Israelite and treating or selling them as a slave, the kidnapper must die. You must purge the evil from among you. So what am I saying here? I'm saying when people look especially at the American experience of slavery, and they note that even some Christians, very misguided Christians, but some Christians used the Bible to justify slavery. And when they say this robs the Bible of all moral authority, they are confusing the situation. The biblical world and the slavery that it contained there was of a very different nature. And there were laws in place, as we have just seen, to limit the practice. And you couldn't kill your slave. That was murder. And the Israelites were essentially told this is a degrading situation. If you can get out of it, get out of it. The Bible does not look upon it as a good thing or as the natural order of society. The Bible looks upon it as something that some people fall into because of bad circumstances and so forth, but encourages them to get out of it if they can and requires owners to let them out of it. But the kind of slavery that we're talking about when we speak of the historical experience of American slavery, or if we talk about human trafficking as it occurs today, that is not only condemned by God, but it is a sin that requires capital punishment. The kidnapper should be put to death. And the society, like ancient Gaza, that performs such an activity is regarded as utterly wicked in the eyes of God. Conclusion. The premise of many modern moral arguments that the Bible allows slavery is a caricature of the Bible's teaching on the subject. Now, you know what a caricature is? A caricature is a picture that has certain details recognizable, but is a gross distortion. And that's what we have when modern people say, well, the Bible allows slavery, and they just leave it at that. Is it true the Bible allows slavery? Yes, it is. But if you just say it in those terms, and slavery for you means what took place in 1840 in the American South, it is a real distortion of what the Bible is actually saying and the culture and language of the biblical world. The Bible's teaching on slavery, I would argue, does not diminish its moral authority. The Bible exists as a book from its own world. However, it has not lost its moral authority regarding slavery. It portrays slavery in certain very specific terms that can be allowed, but even at that, it wants to limit it. It wants to encourage people to stay away from it. But the Bible absolutely rejects the kind of enslavement that we mean when we use the term today. So, when the Bible talks about not only slavery but other issues, such as sexuality, in my view, it still has full moral authority. Okay? Oh my gosh, we've got some more time. Unless you want to quit now.
No.
All right. So does anyone have a question? Go ahead.
In the New Testament, the book of Hebrews, if that's a pejorative, if that's a slang term for slave, was he deliberately doing that to Christian slaves?
No, I think that comes about, any term in the course of centuries, and especially as it is carried over into other languages, its meaning alters, its meaning changes. So that, the term Hebraios, Hebrew, in Greek, basically came to mean Jew. And so it did not have the connotation that it would have had to a 10th century BC Israelite. So I think to the Hebrews, it just means Jews. And I don't think it has any negative connotation. Go ahead.
I guess the elephant in the room, though, is the non-Israelite slave.
Mm-hmm.
Because as Israel went into battle, they would place the terms of peace unless there was a people that they would exterminate, and then they will become our slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And so, or a Hagar,
Mm-hmm.
taken, was from Egypt, and was, the handmaiden or the slave of Sarah. And so, the indebted servitude that of the 7 years, that only applies to the fellow Israelite.
Mm-hmm.
What about all the rest of these that were enslaved and they weren't under the 7-year rule?
Yeah, I wanted to get in the lecture the basic biblical picture of how Israelites governed themselves and how they understood things, but there are other issues, as you just said. So, Israel, in accord with biblical teaching, was not allowed to attack another country, another city, just to take slaves. A slave raid is completely prohibited, and they would have been as condemned for that as Gaza was. The ancient world, as you know, was basically constantly in warfare. little cities, towns, and whole kingdoms like Israel and Ammon or Moab. War was just a constant. And it was that way throughout the ancient world. If you went to ancient Greece with all their city-states, you discover that it was like an annual event. People would go out and one city-state would fight another, and so it just was constantly going on. And if you have a prolonged serious war with a siege, then, there you can offer terms, and surrender does mean enslavement. But my point is that would, in effect, to put it in these terms, that would be a byproduct. If, again, to wage war for the purpose of making slaves, that is forbidden. There's another aspect to it, as you know. The Bible places certain limits on this. It has a very unusual rule. So you're in one of these wars as an Israelite, and a city, it's a very serious fight with a city, and you put that city under siege, and the city falls, and you take some people slavery, or the city surrenders. You take people into slavery, and you take a woman as a slave. Now, in the ancient world, this is their world. We just have to face it. When you took a woman captive as a slave, she could become the slave bride of a soldier. In other words, he could take her to be his wife. She would be, in effect, both his wife and his slave. But Israel had a strange kind of law about that. If you took such a woman, first thing, she had to shave her head and trim her nails, which kind of made her less attractive, I guess. And she had to have a period to mourn for her family, basically to be let alone. And while she mourned for her family, again, she was not to be touched. And then, if the man said, I still want this woman as wife, well, he could take her, but it was a cooling off period. In other words, it wasn't just, I'm going to grab her and take her and rape her and so forth. It was you had to respect her as a human being. You had to set some distance between yourself and her. You had to give her time to deal with the fact that her city has been destroyed and her family and friends killed. And after all that, if you still want to marry her, well, okay. But it is a law that is very different from what you would typically see in ancient warfare, where the women would just be taken and raped and enslaved, and that would be it. So, does Israel have some different rules as applies to the Gentiles? Yes, they do, but I would still contend that they do not, they don't just say, well, it's okay if you do it to other people. It's still understanding that slavery is inherently degrading, and, as I say, attacking and raiding and kidnapping population of villages and such things for slavery is as condemned for Israel as for anyone else. Go ahead.
Do you have more to say on the comment where people say, you Christians are a bit inconsistent and frivolous in which of the Old Testament laws you obey and which ones you give yourself permission to ignore?
That's a very big topic. So I guess there's two different issues here. One issue is what I've been talking about today. Does the Bible's teaching, is it basically depraved and patriarchal such that it has no moral authority? And my argument would be, no, it has moral authority. Now, what it teaches has to be understood within its context. Our context is one in which, we do not deal with poverty through enslavement. So the rules just don't apply to us. But again, my main point is the Bible still has moral authority. The other issue is, are there rules in the Bible we do not follow not because they're immoral, but just because they don't apply to us. And I would say, yes, there are such rules. We talked about kosher. So, is kosher literally obligatory for us? The answer is no, absolutely it is not. But does that mean we ignore kosher laws? That we say, well, that's part of the Old Testament, but hey, it doesn't apply to me, so as far as I'm concerned, it might as well not be in the canon. We could just drop it out. By the way, for those of you who are members of Bow Valley Baptist Church, are you aware of the fact that at one point your church decanonized the Old Testament? Yes, it did. This is true. This is a true anecdote. When I was teaching here and I was at Trinity and I was doing an interim pastorate there, one Sunday night, Bow Valley had a church discussion over whether the Torah is authoritative for us. And kind of divided into two groups, a pro and a con. Then they had a vote. And the vote was no, which I was astonished at. Now, I think, just to be clear, I don't think that the Bow Valley was like deep in heresy, but I do think they needed to be a little more rightly instructed in the way. Because even though we are not literally obligated to keep kosher, the Bible is still authoritative and contains teaching that we should learn from. And that was the whole point of that lecture, that we need restraints in life, that even imposing rules that seem arbitrary and artificial, we need to learn to obey them and keep them because it trains us to have a sense of restraint and propriety and order, to give us the ability to say no to temptation, to understand that we are not free to indulge ourselves. So are the kosher laws authoritative and canonical for us? The answer is yes, they are. Are we obligated to literally keep kosher laws? The answer is no, we are not. And so it is a complicated issue. And it's a caricature if you just say, well, you Christians just arbitrarily decide you're not going to obey this rule. No, we still consider the whole of Torah, the whole Old Testament, the whole Bible, to be authoritative for us. But there are different ways of submitting to its authority, and there are some things that literally do not apply to us. But in terms of the intent of the teaching and the lesson, they very definitely apply to us. So I hope that is helpful. And I'm nothing against Bow Valley, so don't think I'm mad at Bow Valley. I'm not. I found it kind of amusing, and I don't think it damaged the church. It was just kind of a mistake. Go ahead.
I was wondering about the master-slave relationship, or the relationship between Christ as master and ourselves as his bondservants.
Mm-hmm.
Which is the case. But Paul talks about being in debt, a debtor.
Yes. I think Paul's basically using two different metaphors there. So there's the metaphor of the debtor. Someone has given you an enormous benefit and you need to repay it. And of course, Paul, a persecutor of the church, was forgiven by Christ. And so in that sense, he's a debtor. Now, he uses the term doulos in Greek, which is much more a slave. And that's pretty much straightforward, a slave. And so what Paul is saying, a slave to his master has no rights. He just obeys what his master says. And that's how I am with Christ. I don't consider myself to have any rights. I am simply his to do with as he pleases. And so Paul is putting himself in the position of being totally subordinate to Christ. Okay? Yes, how are we doing here? Got time for maybe one more. But if not, go ahead.